Brilliant.
Okay guys, should we kick off? Welcome to this IPPR and Joseph Rowntree Foundation event. I'm Rachel Henry, I'm Head of Advocacy at IPPR. So we've got about an hour. I'm just going to introduce our panellists, then I'll just do a little bit of scene setting, then I'll hand over to panellists just for like 5 minutes remarks. I'll try and keep them to time, and then we'll have a discussion and then hand out to Q&A. Just to let everyone know up top, we did have Lucy Rigby joining us, but she's had an emergency media event. So Lucy won't be joining us, but we're very lucky that we've got brilliant Liam Byrne, Chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee, joining us. Liam, sorry, to somebody? Oh no, sorry. I thought I was getting a heckler. That's exciting. Yeah, so Liam will be joining us about 6:15. So we have here with us Dr. Jeevan Sander. He is Parliamentary Private Secretary at the Department for Business and Trade, and since he was elected in 2024, he's been on the Treasury Select Committee. I've got Chris Belfield. Chris is Principal Policy Advisor working on macroeconomics and fiscal at Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and IPPR's alumnus, not alumnus actually, you still work. Sorry. So Carsten Young is our Associate Director for Economic Policy. So we are here to discuss, is the government turning the tide on growth? So we know that yes, the government has made growing the economy its #1 mission. Following the summer spending review and the release of the government's industrial strategy, a clearer picture of its growth strategy is emerging. At IPPR, our vision of growth is for a shared vision of growth. We really want to, advocate for a model of growth that isn't just about growth, in numbers on a spreadsheet, a line on a graph, but that actually ensuring that the economy delivers tangible improvements in living standards for people all throughout the UK. That's why we were encouraged that living standards is a core component of the government's growth mission. We're keen to hear more and sort of see more of that come through. And we heard the Prime Minister today in his speech echo some of this in his speech, speaking about growth from the grassroots. But the growth outlook still remains uncertain. Amidst a really volatile global economic outlook and supply chain risks, and despite many positive reforms, most households still don't feel that their living standards are improving, and we know that this is what really, really matters to people. So, in this panel, I'm going to hand over for 5 minutes top remarks on is the government turning the tide on growth, and then we'll explore a few questions around the autumn budget, living standards, and how growth can be felt by citizens, and also why Labour's vision of growth is different than the Conservative vision of growth. So Jeevan, let me hand over to you. 5 minutes. Do you think the government is turning the tide on growth?
Yes. The opposite cost. I think, well, look, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is let's talk about why that's happening, and then let's talk about the type of growth that's very important to get. I think firstly is the political scene setter. What is clear at this moment is that these are very angry, fearful, and very divided times. And what we're seeing on our streets is a result of the fact that people have not seen their incomes grow, not just in 2020 or not 2021, but for decades past, unable to see a decent future for themselves or their family. Since deindustrialization, what's happened, what used to be the case is, in the post-war era, you could leave school, get a good job where you live, buy a home and raise your family. That became ever so difficult after deindustrialization. In the new Labour era, we redistributed the proceeds of growth to ensure people were able to share in that economic growth. But on the other side of it, like ensuring everyone has good jobs in every part of the country, I think is something we could have done a lot better on in that time. And then we had, of course, austerity where the economy didn't grow, huge cuts to social security, huge cuts to things that include increases in costs. And now you're in a situation where half the people feel the cost of living crisis will never end. And when they look at their next generation, they are worried, fearful, anxious, uncertain. And that fear is driving so the extreme political events we're seeing, not just the United Kingdom, but indeed across high-income nations. What I'd say is that ensuring that you're having good growth that everyone shares in is not simply an electoral issue, it's not simply about keeping my job in 4 years' time, although that's very, very important. Very important, come to Loughborough, but, and knock on doors, but it's also a democracy-defining issue. That people will not sit or consist in a political system that does not give them a decent living. And 1 in 5 young people who are turning away from democracy are turning away from it precisely because they don't see a way for them to earn a decent future. And indeed, the march a few weeks ago, it would be wrong to characterise everyone who's on that march as far right or racist, but it is fair to say that there are those people who will say your entire answer is just to attack those people over there, and that is your answer to the problem. That's why the economic issue is so important. In terms of what this government is doing on growth, I think there's kind of, I think, 2 main pillars I would draw out on. The first of which is a huge increase in public investment that will lead to a higher capital stock and then going forward greater growth. And the reason why I think we're pretty confident that does work is because it's what we saw happen in the United States during President Biden's term. And I'll come a bit to where that also didn't lead to rising living standards, but certainly that did lead to increased economic growth. And the second thing is really around the barriers to growth. And the thing about planning reform, for example, and the same thing is true of skills, is that when you're looking in the economy, what you're seeing is there's certain things that are, if you like, higher priced in the United Kingdom, and those are the barriers that we're reducing. So it's very hard to build a house because it's very hard to know if you've got sustainable planning permission or critical infrastructure, and it takes a lot longer as well. What you're seeing is a higher cost. There's a clear price signal that if you reduce that, it's leading you to a barrier to growth. And similarly, a premium on skills that you're not seeing elsewhere. So those are like the 2 main, if you like, strategies to help deliver growth in the future. And forecast to forecast, of course, we did see, I would note, that the Biden economy did exceed its forecast because of a huge amount of public investment. I no doubt Carsten will talk about in the future. But then finally talk about what does that growth mean and how does that translate to decent living standards? Because the Prime Minister today, for example, spoke about growth from the grassroots up, for every person, for every place. The thing to say is there's no necessary connection between higher GDP growth on the one hand and higher incomes for every person and every place. So roughly speaking, GDP growth will lead to higher average wages, roughly speaking I should say, and in the UK it's a little bit more complicated, but let's just take that as a given. But actually, if you look at those at the bottom of the income distribution, so for non-pensioners, for example, only about half of their income comes from wages. And that's not because they're not working, it's also because they have child tax credits, working tax credits, or what is now universal credit, i.e. their low wages are being topped up by social security payments. And that's a huge driver to how well they're doing. The second part of it is costs. Now, we've all seen a huge cost of living crisis, we've seen what that meant. While prices went up by about 25% since 2021, the price of essentials like housing, like energy, up by about 40%. And that hits people, but especially hits those at the bottom of the income distribution. And the third thing is really around those social security payments. So why is pensioner policy kind of kept so low, and indeed why they've been relatively well protected during the cost of living crisis, is due to triple lock. And so what the government is doing, if you like, on all 3 of those measures, is measures by which to, yes, raise wages and growth, which I think we know well about, but also to lower costs, investment in energy, investment in childcare, and social security, of course, what we've seen with the triple lock, and I'm seeing rumours of another announcement in that area. So, short answer, yes. Longer answer, yes, absolutely.
Lovely, classic politician. Chris.
Thanks. So when I was thinking about this question about whether the government is turning the tide on growth, it reminded me of being a civil servant and developing the lines to take for either way the current government has turned the tide on growth or where the previous government hadn't turned the tide on growth. And it made me rethink the things that I thought at the time, that a single macro stat on whether the government has turned the tide on growth is almost always misleading. You can almost always pick one to tell the story that you want. So for instance, they're comparing the UK to the other members of the G7. The UK, as we know, has had a slow recovery from COVID, and it's had a slow recovery from the great financial crisis, so it's the 3rd slowest growing economy over that period. But if you look all the way back to 1997 and look up the build-up to the financial crisis, it's the 2nd fastest growing economy in that period. And then looking forwards, the IMF forecast that the UK is going to have the third fastest GDP growth over the next 5 years compared to the G7. But if you look at GDP growth per capita, it's the second slowest. Which, all of this doesn't really mean a lot to households and to people living in the economy. So what have we actually seen what have we actually seen recently? There has been virtually no real wage growth since September last year, and 0.2% over that period. We know that unemployment is rising, and we know that inflation is once again above target. And at JRF, we published some research last week that took the latest economic forecasts and projected what that might mean for what the OBR might say about the economy in their November budget. We found that between today and the end of the Parliament, the average household would face falling incomes, and incomes in 2029 would be £570 per year lower than they are today. That doesn't, to me, feel like turning the tide on growth. That would actually be the worst Parliament on record for growth in living standards, and combining with the poor performance over the last Parliament would lead household incomes to be falling over a decade. And we know that within that, as Juven was alluding to, that it's the lowest income households who will be the worst hit. So turning to government policy and what that means about growth, the two things that Juven highlighted, the investment in public infrastructure and the investment in planning, most economists would agree are exactly the right policies to be doing to turn around growth and to grow the economy. And in fact, as he was saying, we actually persuaded the OBR that this was going to be the case. And I was a civil servant at the time, and persuading the OBR to upgrade their product potential output forecast is no mean feat. And so it's a massive success to achieve that. But if you look at the amount they increased the potential output by in 2029, it is 0.35% of GDP. If you translate that into a 0.35% increase in household incomes, that only offsets 1/3 of the fall in the incomes that I mentioned, that £570 fall. And actually, that £570 already baked in the policies that we're doing. So if we could repeat the two successes of the first year of this government, we would still see incomes falling over the course of this Parliament. Which I think means that we need to think about more radical action on productivity, on growth, in order to boost the household living standards that we need. And far smarter people than I have spent a long time in the economic literature thinking about the UK productivity puzzle and what we need to drive productive growth in the UK. And they come up with a lot of different reasons, although lots of these can be boiled down to underinvestment, whether it's underinvestment in public infrastructure, underinvestment in R&D, underinvestment in skills, underinvestment in management practices, underinvestment in the regions across the UK. It seems to be underinvestment in a variety of ways across the board that potentially explain some of our poor performance and productivity in recent years. And to my mind, or what most economists would think about, one of the main drivers of underinvestment is uncertainty. We've obviously had a lot of shocks over the last 15 years with the great financial crisis, COVID, the energy crisis. We also know that during the 2010s, the UK had a demand-deficient economy, that there was the potential output gap. There wasn't enough demand in the economy to meet all of the supply that we had, which was acting as a drag on growth. That creates insecurity uncertainty for firms that have less confidence over their demand going forward, and therefore may make it more difficult to think about their longer-term investment plans. But we know that once again today we have a negative output gap forecast by both the bank and the OBR. We also know that workers are more productive when they're economically secure, and that entrepreneurs can take more risks. So by increasing the security and the economic security of households and people within our economy, we can, both through supporting demand and making businesses be able to make those decisions, and for entrepreneurs and workers to be able to invest in their own skills and take risks in the economy, boost productive growth.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chris. Carsten, I'll hand over to you for 5 minutes.
Great. So, is the government turning the tide on growth? I think yes. I would say yes, but gonna have something to write about. I think we are. The first thing to say is that we're in a pretty low growth year. The OBR forecast about 1% growth. That's pretty low in for a non-pandemic year, and that's partly because interest rates at the Bank of England are still very, very high, and they're basically depressing growth deliberately in order to stamp out the last bit of inflation. And so if we didn't have so high inflation, we put much more steam in the economy than is currently the case. So if inflation continues to go down, which there are signs it will, but it's still elevated, the Bank of England will lower its rates and growth will bounce back. So the OBR expects basic growth to be double next year than what it is this year. And so some of the sort of doom and gloom that sometimes you hear in the commentaries of in the media that growth disappoints, or another blow for Chancellor Reeves because GDP growth hasn't been as good. I think a lot of it is due to we just still have slightly too high inflation, and that's why the bank is holding growth back. So I think there will be, the next year will be a good news year on growth, almost naturally as things normalize. And that will be, but that's of course also partly because the government has made a lot of good decisions of growth, which I'll get to. But we've heard the point on living standards. Living standard, like real disposable income, is still only just surpassed where it was pre-pandemic. So we had more than 5 years where basically, we were in a cost of living crisis, and we're basically only just getting to where we were before. And especially for lower income households, they're still about 4 or 5% below where they were pre-pandemic. So that's terrible, and that's why reform and other far right or populist parties are getting so much traction because the cost of living crisis is real. Hopefully, though, as we see the growth pick up, that can be more widely shared. And we can get maybe in discussion to what exactly we can do to make sure that it will be widely shared. One thing, though, to say is that just getting growth up and then sort of redistributing it, which was broadly the Blair-Brown strategy, right? It's just like get high growth and then we do more distribution, and then growth is widely shared in that sense. That might not be enough, even if it works. What also needs to be the case, and I think that gets to your question of like how is this government different from perhaps the Conservatives, is there are other forms of prosperity that aren't just sort of checks in the mail or your income at the end of the month. And so the Employment Rights Bill is a great example of something that's like really, really popular and makes people, just directly improves people's lives. Another one is the Renters' Rights Bill, which again just reduces the hassle that people have in their life, the insecurity, the uncertainty. And there are some that argue the government should roll back on these in the name of growth, but we're very clear that this is part and parcel of a prosperous society, is to have these security. And by the way, like the Employment Rights Bill is not like this massive red tape that we're wrapping around UK business. It's basic stuff like you have the right to a certain amount of hours rather than being completely at the whim of your employer. So in other countries it would be laughable to even discuss these rights. So this is not like a massive amount of red tape, but like these things make a real difference in people's lives. And when we talk about growth and is prosperity improving, we should rally around these types of reforms because it will make people feel better off. So it's really important, I think, that progressives make the case for these types of reforms rather than sort of in the name of a slightly higher GDP trend line, throwing everything overboard. I think that is a key difference between what Labour has outlined and what we've seen previously. The other thing I just wanted to briefly highlight is another really cool thing that this government has done is the industrial strategy, which, as far as I know, it seems to me the most ambitious and sophisticated attempt at a modern industrial strategy in the developed world. Like everywhere else where you have more intervention in the economy and the government tries to steer certain sectors and support certain sectors, it feels much more crude. Whereas here, and maybe Chris knows the prowess of the UK civil service, like, as it's a really solid work that tries to disentangle which sectors have the highest potential for growth. And you have like net zero industries, creative industries, professional services, advanced manufacturing. So sort of a mix of foundational things like energy, net zero, and bread and butter stuff like professional services that the UK is very good at. And really, the government and the civil service have really tried to think through, well, how do we boost these industries? And really leaning into that and continuing down, delivering this will be really important, I think, for making sure we don't just bounce back next year, but we sort of sustain long-term growth. And some sectors are more worked out than others. So Ed Miliband's part of the industrial strategy, very, very clearly defined, and lots of policies. Others like professional services and creative industries, less so. So I think one thing to look for in the autumn budget is like, and it might not be in the budget, but sort of in the wake of it, is like, do we get a continued push on industrial strategy? Because that is really, we've picked these sectors as high potential, and kind of urging the government to really deliver on those and deliver policies on those, I think will be really important.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to take chair's privilege just to ask a couple of questions. I want to dig a little bit into this kind of idea of a Labour vision of growth and potentially why that is different to a Conservative vision of growth. So I feel like the Prime Minister today, was talking about growth from the grassroots. Rachel yesterday in her speech was saying, don't ever let somebody tell you that a Labour government isn't different to a Conservative government. We know that the economic context at the moment is incredibly different than it was in the 90s or in the 80s. So why is this vision, why is Labour's vision of growth different? And what lessons can we learn either from the past or internationally about why and how it needs to be different? I will hand over to you.
Brilliant. I will say, well, before I start, Chris and Carsten are two of the cleverest economists I know. I quoted Chris a lot during my PhD, and I've worked with Carsten before, and luckily got to co-author, which was quite nice. Back in the Liz Truss days. That was fun. I think, okay, so let's start with Labour values and what that means, because your values lead to your vision, which then lead to your policies. Labour values are this, that every single person should be able to live a good life. And all the writings of Crossland or whichever socialist thinkers you want to talk about, Jenkins, and we can spend hours and hours and hours, but fundamentally it's that. And this distinction between us and the radical right, what is now I think the radical right and radical left is, they would say only some people should be able to live a good life. So for the Conservatives between 2010 and 2024, it doesn't matter if you're in poverty because we don't care if you can afford a decent life. It doesn't matter actually if you're a non-pensioner because we're not really too concerned about you either. We're really concerned about pensioners and high-income non-pensioners. That's our electoral coalition. These are the places we're going to guarantee. And actually looked at those particular sectors, both high asset price growth as well as tax cuts, but they actually did relatively well. So what we would experience as being a general decline in the economy, actually their prospects were okay. And that is the fundamental difference between us and the others. What that also leads you to then is a progressive set of taxation choices, because actually, of course, if you're wealthier, you need a lower portion of your income, if you like, to live a decent life. Now, absolutely, you can have a nice house and have a nice car and have all those things, but the higher tax rate will be used in that to invest in, well, both investment and redistribution to make each person better off. So those are the Labour values that we have, and therefore that leads to, if you like, both a growth strategy and a living standard strategy that ends up leading it towards those points. And so when you're looking across the distribution, the question is not just, I think as Chris touched on, it's not just about GDP growth as a broad figure, because there is no law of economics that says that if you work hard, you'll get a decent living, nor is there any law of economics that says if the economy grows, you will be better off. Right? The economy grows just means that total output is growing. And so for a Labour Party, in this Labour government, it's about intervention strategies to ensure that people are sharing in that growth. And I suppose if I could pick up particularly on people and places, both the infrastructure strategy announced at the last budget, the last budget, but not the last fiscal event, where I can't remember how we count them. Don't tell Rachel if I got that wrong. If it wasn't a fiscal event, it wasn't a fiscal event, and if it was, it was. But the National Infrastructure Strategy, all about huge amounts of investment going outside of London, Green Book reform about investment going outside of London, devolution ensuring that actually we're making decisions that are benefiting places outside of London. That's every single person in place doing well. And on the people side, as you saw today, an announcement on skills, that's about actually, what about non-graduates who can earn a decent living? Can I ask a quick question? Who in this room didn't go to university? Yeah. But this is part of the problem, I think, with the policy discourse, and one thing I think that this Labour government will absolutely fix, which is if I could just end on this and talk about what I think is one of the most fundamental issues that we have. To earn a decent life, you need to earn about 35k a year. That's enough for you to raise a family on. 2 parents and 35k each. That's the bare basics. That's from like the JRF research, so sorry if you were going to. 40% of full-time workers earn less than £35,000 a year. So how are you ensuring that those people in that part of the wage distribution, if you like, are going to be able to earn a decent life? And what's the Labour growth strategy? Well, actually saying, hey, how can we ensure you do so? Through investment, through wages, through social security.
Brilliant, thank you. Chris, I'm going to come to you. So my question was, what lessons do we need to learn about what this model of growth should be going forward? Why should it be different than the past or
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I actually wanted to pick up on something Carsten said about not just measuring growth through accounting and GDP growth and wages, and talking about the employment rights bill and the renters rights bill. Not only do they contribute to prosperity, as you pointed out, but we couldn't think of those things as contributing to economic growth as well. By providing secure work and confidence of the number of hours an employee is going to have week to week, that has the potential to make an employee more productive. By knowing you're going to have an employee over the long term rather than employing gig economy workers, there is an incentive from the firm to invest in that person, to invest in the skills in that person and make them more productive and grow their wages. So not only should we not be talking about, what are the growth downsides of an employment bill, what are the growth downsides of providing renters security so that they can stay in an area, be confident, invest in some skills and get jobs in that area. We should be thinking about how, by those 2 reforms, boosting the security of workers, of renters, that they can actually contribute to economic growth because people are able to take long-term decisions and benefit from those in terms of higher productivity and higher wages going forwards. But we should go further than this. We should think about, Liz Truss tried, how do we cut taxes, how do we have trickle-down economics? What about other ways we can invest in the security of households, boosting the amount of, for example, the relationship between unemployment insurance and the quality of the job match that you get when you come out of that unemployment insurance. Is it worth us having a more generous unemployment system so that people can spend longer looking for a job and they get the right job and then they have higher productivity as a result? What are the growth benefits of that, of supporting people to be able to take the risks that they need to in the economy, whether that's moving jobs or taking time to look for the right jobs, and how do we capture those growth benefits? Because then not only have we supported the households so that everybody can live a good life, but we then create the opportunities for people to be able to invest in their careers and get the productivity and those growth benefits as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. We're very lucky to be joined by Liam Byrne. He is chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee and a very good friend to IPPR, so yes, welcome Liam. Liam, the question we are discussing broadly is the government turning the tide on growth? So I want to just open up to you for a few remarks, kind of give us a few minutes on what's your take. Do you think we're turning the tide on growth?
So, so yes, and unlike perhaps I'm sort of kind of like sort of freedom in this post-ambition stage of my career, to sort of share with you some kind of honest views. So the answer is basically yes, and you know, when the manifesto was being readied, I don't think anybody could have quite forecast the upending of the global trade system that unfolded after the election of President Trump. And you know, when you look back at the IMF forecasts about the downgrades to global growth that ensued after the president tried to inject maximum political uncertainty into the global trading system, then actually the growth that we've achieved in the face of that is actually pretty impressive. Second highest growth in the IMF so far this year. And I think it's just important to kind of remember what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to do is something that is very difficult. We're trying to shift from what was a 10 to 15 year demand side strategy, where the Tories basically said, look, if we just cut tax on business and cut tax on business and cut tax on business, then magically somehow there will be a surge of investment in the economy and all will be well. That palpably failed. And so, you know, what Rachel and colleagues are trying to do is drive through this modern supply side strategy, which basically tries to reverse the original sin of the British economy, which are investment rates which are much too low. And in particular, we now know that it's investment rates in intangible capital, you know, skills, innovation, R&D, that are the particular problem for the UK economy. So again, you know, look at the IMF advice from August, special report on the UK economy. What they basically unpack is why has productivity been so much faster in the US after the great financial crash compared to the UK? You know, and the answer basically is that we have had a systemic failure in investment rates. So, you know, the Chancellor mobilising a significant amount of public investment, good thing. Coupling that with stable public finances that has allowed 5 cuts in interest rates, good thing. But what is proving a bit stickier is actually kind of driving through the creation of the new institutions that our economy needs in order to really unlock the kind of non-inflationary growth that would allow interest rates to come down and GDP growth to go faster. So, in no particular order, you know, those institutions are a broken energy market. You know, overwhelmingly the advice that we get from Business on the Business Trade Committee is that energy costs are sky high. You know, we had Nissan recently tell us, you know, the factory in Sunderland, you know, has got the highest energy cost in the world for Nissan. So just that sky high energy cost is a significant problem. Energy market broken. We don't yet see a clear enough path through to bring energy costs down on our committee. Second, I would say on innovation investment, I think actually the government has delivered some pretty significant numbers of investment there. Again, lots of work to do to just connect universities, colleges into, in particular, local SME bases. So those kind of local growth platforms are not quite there in the right place, in our view. And then you've got skills. And you know, here again as a committee we've recommended quite radical devolution of skills policy to local areas, the regional economies, which are in our view much better able to connect together skills strategies that work locally to give employers much greater control over qualifications. And then the final bit is government procurement, which is still pretty broken. You know, it's £1.06 in the British economy. John Healey has set out some pretty aggressive reforms to defence procurement, which actually the rest of the government can learn from. So until you kind of remake some of those economic institutions in the way that we could and should, we're not quite sure you're going to get the supply side effects that we really need to harness. And then I suppose the final point I would make is just to come back with a plea not to forget missions. We basically argue that missions should be better understood as grand challenges. So, you know, having a mission of promoting economic growth, that's great. But actually, if you really want to galvanise public sector and private sector, different parts of the state, different parts of government together, then actually grand challenges, in our view, is a much better way of mobilising that collective effort and simply saying we would like to grow the economy faster.
Thank you. Brilliant comments, thanks. So, Glenn, before you joined, we were having a bit of a discussion about why a Labour vision of growth is different than a Conservative vision of growth. You know, discussing the fact that the Prime Minister today was, talking a lot about growth from the grassroots, and Rachel wanted to make the point yesterday about about a Labour government. It's definitely been different to a Conservative government. But so I guess I want to kind of move on, from the kind of vision principles point to tangible proof points. What do we think? What more do we think the government can be doing to ensure that Labour vision of growth is embedded throughout the UK? What should we be looking out for in the budget and in the wider economic strategy? I'm just going to hand over to Carsten first. Carsten, you give us a few reflections, and then Liam, I'll hand back to you.
I think it's good to answer that. I think it's just important to underline just how poor our investment track record has been in the UK. So of the last 3 decades, 27 years of the last 3 decades, we were the lowest investing country in the G7. So if you just look at the league table, we were almost always at the bottom. I think the 3 years where we weren't was during COVID, where the stats went a bit awry. But so we really, and that is particularly the case in outside London and the southeast. So to answer the question of how do we make growth spread, it's really it sounds a bit annoying, I don't know, but we need to get investment up across the country and get investment up in small and medium-sized companies which are not very good at investing by international comparison, and they're not very good at investing in their staff training. So there is no very easy answer to that, but we can definitely, it's probably the accumulation of a lot of small policies that could help. We heard today, a much higher role of apprenticeships, which again the UK has been traditionally bad. Investing more in this, we talk about skills, but we really haven't fixed the skill system in the UK, both in terms of funding as well as in terms of further education. So making progress on that would be really, really important. And I'll just finish with another maybe right-wing sounding point, but one problem why we've, Rachel Reed hammers this a lot, one problem why we haven't had more investment in the UK is that interest rates have been so high, and given where we are as an economy, interest rates are about 1 percentage point higher than where they should be. And that is partly because there hasn't been the certainty that Chris talked about in the beginning, and people still don't quite know where the UK is going with its fiscal and business strategy. So it would be, that's why so we've recommended changing the fiscal rules in the past last year, and one of our recommendations was adopted. So we're not in the camp of saying Rachel Reeves should change her fiscal plans and borrow more at this point, and rather really double down on the strategy she's outlined. And again, also doubling down on being very clear on what the tax reform plans are going forward, including there are a lot of tax reforms that could be made for corporate taxation, for capital gains taxation, for business rates, really giving certainty on the pathway for those taxes in a way that gives certainty for business to invest will be really important. So it's important, I think, for progressives to also be yes, we want radical change, yes, we want all these types of exciting investments, but we also need to really double down on these stability points and be clear about the economic strategy.
Great, thanks, Carsten. Liam, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So let me just make 3 points about living standards, communities, and universal basic capital. So, the reason that we've got about a third of the UK population now considering voting for reform is overwhelmingly because those families have been trapped in a multi-generational living standards crisis for the best part of the last 20 years. And so in polling that we've published, it's on my Substack for a summary, but it's published in Best for Britain and YouGov. What is really clear is that the 5 things that unite reform voters is that their living standards are under acute pressure, they live in very precarious communities. Hardcore reform voters, 80% say their communities are in sharp decline. They're profoundly pessimistic about the future. 2/3 think that their wealth is going to decline over the next decade. They're therefore really seized by a sense of dispossession that is triggered by immigration, and they think that politics is broken. And so unless you can get inside that matrix and reverse the downward pressure on living standards, you're not going to make progress politically. And for many of these voters, it's not just that hard work doesn't pay, it's hard work hasn't paid. And actually, they don't think that's going to change for the future. So their expectations of the next 10 to 15 years are pretty dark too. Now, the challenge for progressives is that this group of voters also are profoundly sceptical about whether tax money is well spent, and they are profoundly sceptical about whether they get their fair share of public spending. In fact, about 80% say that they don't get their fair share of public spending. And so, we haven't published this work yet, but we will just before the budget. It will basically show that the kinds of things that people in this predicament are asking for from government is help with reducing energy costs and a tax cut. Which is, by the way, the same conclusion that the Australian Labour Party came to before the next election. Now, how do you do that in a way that honours, I think, the very sensible remarks that Carsten makes about not mucking around with the fiscal rules? You've got to fund it from somewhere, right? And so where do you fund it from? Well, you've got to begin restructuring the tax burden from work to wealth, and frankly, you've got to do more at the top end in order to alleviate the pressure. That gain from tax reform, from tax restructuring, has got to release more money for community reinvestment, like the great Pride in Place programme announced last Thursday. But in my view, it should also do something more, and this is to burgle under DAT, a brilliant idea from the IPPR, which is to basically start seeding the creation of a sovereign wealth fund in the UK, a Commonwealth Fund, which is the conclusion IPPR came to in its Economic Justice Commission. And once you build up a sovereign wealth fund of about 200 billion, which actually you could do in this country in the space of about 5 years, that's enough to supply a one-off dividend to every 25-year-old in the country of about £10,000. Why £10,000? It's the average shortfall on the deposit to buy a home. So a system of universal basic capital, I think, is much better than the kind of universal basic income ideas that have been around for a while, because what it begins to do is to give people a stake in their community, to give people a stake in society, a stake in the economy, and it rekindles the idea that both John Rawls and on the left, and Noel Skelton came to on the right, of the wealth-owning democracy. And actually that, I think, is one of the ways in which you begin to rebuild a sense that we are indeed all in it together.
Brilliant, thank you, Liam. I am going to open out for audience questions. So if I can see hands. Yes, this lady here. I'll take 3 and then hand to the panel.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the discussion. Angela Francis from WWF. The highest interest rates that were mentioned are a function of the Bank of England trying to tackle what is essentially fossil fuel, extreme weather prices feeding through to energy prices and fuel prices, treating it as if it's an overheating economy when it's just cost-push inflation. How do you think about the character of growth we need to build in terms of net zero and nature positive? We look at a lot of that work as a route to stimulate private investment, tackle some of the costs that really hit the poorest, and also give some co-benefits which they suffer from in our existing fossil fuel economy. we see lots of potential to do this, and I would also say to Liam's point, Mariana Mazzucato would make this like a mission for the economy, but we only have clean energy, we don't have the rest of it.
Yeah. And Joe.
Always nice when your name is there. Joe Rowe from Tax Justice UK. There's about 1,200 or so tax exemptions and reliefs on the books, which tends to generate a lot of growth for tax advisors, but when it gets that big, tends to hamper the economy because it's too complicated. So I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on reforming the tax system and tax simplification for promoting growth.
Great, thanks. I'll take one more. This lady here.
Hello, I'm Juliet, so I work for Christians Against Poverty, and some of our research shows that 1 in 5 UK adults have a deficit budget, so not enough income to cover the cost of essentials. So I've been really encouraged to hear some of the discussion being brought up around just the realities of what households on low income are facing and how that is feeding into reforms agenda and conversations around there. But there is this constant grapple between needing that instant, immediate relief and also the long-term policy planning. So just wondering, how does the Labour government grapple with the policy planning, but also the communication needed to make sure that the UK population is brought along with your plans around growth?
Great, thank you. Okay, great. So we've got a question on kind of interest rates and shocks, one on tax reliefs, and one on kind of living standards cons. So Jeevan.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I'm not allowed to comment about the NPC, what they do. I'll leave others. Cost will definitely have a go, but I will leave that to them. But say, of course, you are investing in ways to get down prices, which I think this government is doing. As you mentioned on clean energy, irrespective of what the bank's view is in terms of the cost push, inflation needs a demand, or rather a change in inflation expectation, would kind of go away. Part of the problem you're also identifying is actually that food prices, for example, are being driven by wider climate shocks. That is very true. It's probably to reduce carbon, but of course in this country we are limited in what we could do into reducing those worldwide cost shocks. So for us, it's really investing to get down the cost that we can, of which energy, of which I'd also say housing, childcare is another one. But more broadly, there also is going to be other climate shocks that I think we're going to be quite limited on. Joe, I definitely can't talk about that. I'm really sorry about that. And Julia, people are not. There's two things. There's a values piece. What do we stand for? What do we stand against? And you heard the Prime Minister speak about that, but that also leads into an economic argument. Every single person, we value every single person. We have common interests, common connections. That's where it starts. But the other bit of it is that people, I think, are going to really believe us when they see the difference. They voted for change, as people have said, a lot, and they haven't seen that change come. So until we kind of deliver, they will just say, yeah, but where is the change? And also just a final point on the structural problem. You're right, the structural issue of working hard and not needing decent living is, I think, the fundamental problem that every single high-income nation is struggling with, and that's just, for me, the proximate fundamental cause of the rise of populism and now the threat to democracy. And on that note, cheerio, I have to go.
Jeevan, thank you
But I'm
very
going to
much.
slightly leave without me.
No, love it. I might get Carsten to budge up when you go. Jeevan, thank you very much. That was brilliant. I am going to hand over to Chris. So, Chris, we had a collection of questions: interest rates, tax reliefs, and kind of living standards cons. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to start thinking about the reality for families that are living on those very low incomes. And at JRF, we do some polling of the 40% households in the 40% lowest incomes. And with that, we find that in the last 6 months, 7 million low-income households have gone without essentials such as food, heating, or basic toiletries. And we also look at 4.5 million of those households have gone into arrears on household bills, and also 4 million households are taking out loans to fund the cost of essentials, which they then have to pay debt interest on those loans. Same problem Rachel Reeves actually faces with meeting any school rules. And so the reality is very difficult for those households. And I think this comes back to the wider growth problem. If you're struggling to meet the cost of essentials, you are also probably struggling, and it's going to have an impact on your role of getting goods, a pure job, or investing in your skills and boosting your productivity growth. So the question on tax, I don't know the 1,200 different tax exemptions, but there are inefficiencies in our tax system. We don't tax we don't tax income from investment at the same rate we tax income from labor. We don't charge NICs on rental income, we don't charge NICs on dividends. We have loopholes in our capital gains tax system so that if someone passes away and passes on capital to the next generation, they avoid capital gains tax through the inheritance system, or if they leave the country, we don't charge capital gains on any assets that they held and then sell or take out of the country. So there are reforms to charging NICs on those on different forms of income and reforming our capital gains system that can raise in excess of £20 billion. And that money can be spent to improve the lives of the people who are struggling with the cost of essentials by scrapping the two-child limit, which is unclear whether or not the government have committed to doing so in the media today, or introducing a protected minimum income floor, so there's a threshold under which benefits cannot fall, or with sanctions or through the benefit cap, can support households so that they can meet the cost of essentials. Carsten, do you want to pick up the monetary policy point? Because, yeah, I'll leave that one.
Yeah, I was going to come over to Carsten and ask him actually just to focus. I'm sorry, you're only getting interest rates because I'm keen to take a couple more questions. Take it away on interest rates.
Yeah. So the only official tool we have to fight inflation is interest rates, and so the Bank of England is basically using interest rates to go after inflation, even though, as you correctly say, basically what we're seeing is just like the long hangover of like an energy shock that's like working its way through the system, and ideally you'd have a toolkit that more directly targets that shock. But we don't have that toolkit, so I'm trying to come up with a metaphor here, right? We're using a baseball bat to open a jar of jam or something like that. So it's sort of splattering everywhere in the kitchen as a result. And others have done better. Like Spain is an interesting example. They had the same energy shock. They, to begin with, had a lot more renewables, and so the energy shock has hit them way less hard. But secondly, they also had more of a, you might call, industrial policy that was sort of hastily, like Liz Truss actually did a little bit to try to lower energy prices, but Spain was quick out of the block. They basically artificially held energy prices down, and so the impact on the system was less severe, and so there's less sort of aftershock effects in Spain. I think that the learning is, like, we weren't ready to deal with that when it hit us, but the learning is A, if we had more renewables, we would have a less severe shock, and secondly, if we had a broader toolkit, like economic toolkit to defend against such shocks, like the next time a food price spike hits, can we have a plan for how we keep food prices low so it doesn't hit it doesn't hit ordinary people as much with all the political consequences that we know. So there is sort of a nascent field in economics that's trying to think about what does this toolkit look like. Sadly, it's often dismissed as sort of too interventionist. But again, the countries that did do some of these things did much better politically. Like Pedro Sanchez's progressive government was one of the only progressive governments, one of the only governments, full stop, to survive the inflation shock. And it's partly because they had this toolbox. So I think we a lot to learn here, and I think also for the Labour government to learn here.
Really interesting. Liam, I'll pass over to you.
Let's pick up one of the questions on tax. So, there are lots of things that can still be done on tax. I mean, the problem with the loopholes argument, and I hear the loopholes argument a lot, is that it never sort of takes the next kind of couple of steps that politicians need, which is to anticipate the blowback and the row and the argument about the destruction of the industry, which is concentrated in an area which is no doubt about some by-election, and so just the kind of the political economy of loophole reform is often the bit that goes awry. But there are kind of three things that we could kind of crack on with now. So One is closing the tax gap. So the tax gap is now ballooned to I think about 48 billion. I think on the last figures. Overwhelmingly that tax gap is concentrated on small and medium-sized enterprises. And when, partly for my own entertainment, but I was curious. So we brought the head of HMRC tax design in front of the committee a week or two ago just to kind of ask what was going on. And it turns out there's about 4 million phone calls that don't get answered. So here are people who kind of want to figure out how to pay their tax. They'd like to ring up and ask a couple of questions. We just don't answer the phone. And so, it remains true that the most efficient way of increasing the tax take is to hire more tax inspectors. And so the government has done, some good in this area. I think they've employed about another 800. But frankly, it's the kind of minimum. And so, more of that, please. Second, the point made about national insurance contributions on investment income, on landlord income, absolutely essential. Beginning to equalise capital gains tax, as that good old socialist Nigel Lawson once did. These are all measures that can bring in anywhere between 5 and 10 billion each. And look, billion here, billion there, it all adds up quite quickly. And so it is possible to see a path to both covering some of the challenges on the deficit, which I suspect are going to crystallise in the budget, and to begin to make progress towards one of the best bits of public policy research I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, which is the work on the Essentials Guarantee, and capitalise the beginning of a Commonwealth fund that could provide a one-off dividend for young people. These things are actually possible. You can't magic the money overnight, but actually a strategy that unfolds over 5 to 7 years could make an absolute lot of difference.
Brilliant, thank you, Liam. Just a little plug for a lot of IPPR's tax work. So a lot of the taxes that Liam just mentioned that do add up to many billions. We're publishing a lot of work on tax at the moment, so take a look. I'm going to squeeze in, I think, one more question. I think 2 might be pushing it. So this lady got her hand up first.
Thanks very much. I've had my hand up in a few sessions and I haven't been asked, so it's great to get the chance. I'm Ros Bird, I'm the Chief Exec at Norwich Research Park. I come from a commercial background, work for BT Pension Fund and the like. So I made this point before and I just wonder why it hasn't been picked up, because it seems obvious to me. You want to look for return on investment everywhere you go, as quickly as possible. You think about the amount of money we spend from just age 4 to 18 on kids' education, everybody. Why doesn't the government look to improve careers education once and for all, so that at the end of that investment, age 18, they've had really good chance to think about what they're good at, what they like, and the job opportunities, and then they choose the correct careers pathway and get into a job. I've met so many people, like young people, go into school and talk to them about Silverstone. I've worked there in Norwich, and you talk about all the jobs created, and you get young people really excited and inspired. They suddenly realise they just have to work hard and do their best. There'll be all kinds of jobs out there for them. They don't need to write themselves off. And then they come up to you and say, I'm really excited, so where do I need to go to do general engineering, or where do I need to go to start getting onto that career ladder? You've inspired me and given me confidence. And I don't have the answer myself, and the careers advice is very limited. So I really think we could invest as a government in really, really good careers education for young people, and it could be a game changer for the economy.
Okay, right. A question on careers advice, and also, I guess kind of it would be interesting to touch on the Chancellor's announcement yesterday. Liam.
So someone asked me on a panel earlier today, what is the jobs market going to look like in 2035? And I have no idea. But that's my point, right? So we don't necessarily know what those jobs are going to look like, but we do know some of the capabilities that you're going to need. And very often that picture is best put together locally, not nationally. And so what I find, so I visit a school in my constituency every fortnight. We do the school council, meet the eco council, do a school day with parents after. And the one thing that I've learned from that work is that you have to start careers education and thinking with children from about the age of 7 or 8. Not least because you want to give them a sense of their potential, but also because you want to trigger their imagination. So, the story I told in response to that question was about a head teacher at Hartfield School who won 80,000 quid in a STEM award because the kids were doing super well, and asked me, right, what should I spend this money on? And I said, well, look, the last estimates I saw showed that we've got an engineers gap in this country of about 40,000 a year. You should think of how, equipping kids with those kind of skills. The next time I went back, about 6 months later, she'd built like a maker's lab in the basement. And these kind of 8-year-old kids in our lot were programming robots, and they'd set up a media studio, and they were just extraordinary. And I just thought, how amazing would it be if we did this in every school?
It's 1 hour a week at the moment.
Yeah.
Kids are entitled to 1 hour, and if they don't have computers in the school, it's not the computer, it's not the trained
Yeah,
teacher.
just it would make a huge difference. I mean, the one sort of further step that I would just add is that, if we actually equipped, where we have the mayors, we're not councils, with the capability to do that local forward labour market planning, so that that information is available. I mean, I'm in East Birmingham. High Speed 2 is about to transform our economy. All kinds of new jobs are opening up. I have yet to meet a head teacher or a teacher in a classroom who knows anything about the transformation of the local economy that is going to unfold over the next 10 years. Literally, they know nothing about it. And so, unless we can just glue some of this back together, so I 100% agree with all of this.
Brilliant, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, thank you very much, Liam. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so I am going to move to closing reflections. Chris, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And kind of inspired by that question about the opportunities facing young, I'm never close enough to the mic. Facing young people. One thing is to teach the kids about those opportunities, but the other is for those opportunities to exist, and for those opportunities to exist in all of the regions of the UK. Like we've talked about the bank and their fight to get inflation down and the amount of demand that's in the economy, but that actually varies a lot across the different regions, and the labour market looks really different. Like the number of vacancies per person on universal credit in some areas of the country exceeds 20 to 1. Like we don't just need education to get people into those jobs. We actually need the jobs to exist there for the people to go into too, by investing in those local areas, and also to have a social security system that supports people to be able to take the risks to move between jobs. If productivity grows by people being in the right jobs and the right careers, as you mentioned, then allowing people to take the risk of switching careers, knowing that if it doesn't work out, we have a social security system in place that can support them to continue to meet the cost of essentials if that fails, is vital to allowing to have a functioning economy.
Great, thank you, Chris. Carsten.
Great. I was just going to finish with something we're currently thinking about, which is the current approach to boosting growth is sort of quite gradualist.
Yeah.
Like I was talking about the industrial strategy sectors and the civil service has come up with really detailed plans, and then there's lots of money sprinkled everywhere. But given, and sort of you alluded to it with your where's the labour market going to be in 10 years' time point, technological change and also global geopolitical tensions mean that we might see quite rapid changes in the economy, both in terms of what we need to make domestically, thinking about defense, and other maybe supply chains might be cut off, so we might have to do more in the UK, more manufacturing in the UK. But also, we're in the midst of an AI race that will very likely transform our economy and labour markets, and we're doing some work on this at IPPR as well. So if that scenario is true, and it might not, but it might be true that we get quite significant change, then maybe in the next couple of months, maybe not right now when interest rates are really high and we're just trying to steady the ship and so on, but over the next year, then there might be a point where we should ask ourselves, do we need to make some big bets on where we want to position the UK? Are we getting enough investment in frontier technologies? are we investing enough in like rapid retraining of the workforce to move into other sectors? Again, you know, this might be wrong, and it's kind of might be some boosterish, futurist hyperbole, but I think there's a pretty decent chance that there are some quite big changes in training, and so some more gradualist, you know, 15-year strategy might be not enough, and we might have to do a lot more investing, a lot more job retraining, a lot more thinking about big bets on making the UK more resilient. So I think that's just kind of like an interesting new area that is coming down the pipeline.
Great, thanks. And Liam, I'll pass to you to close out.
Thanks. I think that's a very thoughtful set of reflections to close on. So the reality is that our superstar firms are not as productive as American superstar firms by quite some distance, and so some of the new investments that have been announced in technology and AI and the public funding that's going into innovation is virtuous and important, but you know, we have got to kind of push at this, and we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve unless we fix the problem of scale-up finance. So right now, our most high potential firms are being invested in and lifted and shifted back to the United States, and many of these firms, by the way, have billions of pounds of public investment from the UK taxpayer in the innovations that let them grow in the first place. That's problem one. Problem two then is how do we do a far more effective job at diffusing innovation through the UK economy? And this is where I kind of come back to the fact that we just don't have regional economic institutions in the way that we need them. We don't have them in finance, we don't really have them in innovation, definitely don't have them in skills, haven't really got them in procurement either. So unless we kind of remake these kind of local economic institutions, I don't think we're going to get that diffusion right. And then just to kind of close the circle, I suppose with Carsten's remarks, is that we are now in a much more shocky global economy, and it could well be that economic security imperatives force us to rethink this in quite a radical way. So we have a big report coming out on this in 2 or 3 months' time, which will basically make the point that the UK's economic security regime is no longer fit for the modern world, and where we're going to have to think a lot harder, a lot faster about the kind of sovereign capabilities we need here in the UK, what we're going to trade for, what we're going to build here, and how we're then going to defend that economy from the threats that we will now confront.
Brilliant, thank you, Liam. Thank you very much to everyone coming. Thank you to Joseph Rowntree Foundation for sponsoring this event. And thank you very much.